Awesome. That's awesome. Right, welcome everyone. All right, so we can get started, and then as people come in, they can continue to join in. So as you're coming in, put your location in the chat. This is one of our monthly Build Up webinars with the Build Peace community. For those of you that have joined before, you've heard this spiel, but we host these monthly calls with those working, within peace building and technology, or those fields that are adjacent to it, to further learning and to have the opportunities to explore exciting conversations ourselves too. This is recorded, and we'll be posting the posting the recording on YouTube afterwards. And so if you have something in the chat that you'd rather not say, or, if you want your name scrubbed for any reason, just private message me and I'm happy to do that for you. And if you're missing it, or if you have others, your colleagues or those in your networks that you want to send this to afterwards, you can send them the link. So the format of this conversation is going to be, we have a few questions here for Darshan, who's joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. He is, Darshan, I'll just let you introduce yourself actually. Is that okay?
Right now? Yeah.
Okay.
I am an unexpected academic living in Phoenix. I'm at Arizona State University, and I'm an assistant professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society, which is this really interdisciplinary, fun, newish school at ASU, as well as the Polytechnic School, which is one of the schools of engineering.
That's awesome. Thank you. Didn't want to introduce you as if you were not here and could speak for yourself just then. So if you read the webinar description, you might also be expecting Jerry, who is my colleague at Build Up, who is a fellow peace engineer with Darshan. Jerry couldn't make it today, so you have the B team, which is me, and I'm not a peace engineer, but a fan of it. And so we're going to have just a conversation for about 20 minutes with Darshan. I have some questions for him, and then we'll, of course, open it up to everybody. But if you have questions along the way, feel free to put those in the chat or in the Q&A function that is on the bottom part of your Zoom screen. Cool. So I feel like the first question, Darshan, is what is peace engineering?
Oh gosh, I was scared you were going to ask that question. And to start off with, so full disclosure, I have been deeply connected to people involved in peace engineering and building out peace engineering, like Mira Olson at Drexel, like Jerry and folks at Build Up. I myself have been tangentially involved in it, in that I care about engineering for environmental protection, social justice, peace, and human rights, but I haven't really conceived of my work as peace engineering. That said, there's a couple ways in which I think about it. So I don't know if I can give you a definition of peace engineering, but there are some questions that I have, or ways in which I think about the notion that I can share. So I guess I generally start off with thinking about what are the kinds of things that engineers and the engineering profession and like our socioeconomic structures, what are the kinds of technological investments that we prioritize? And to what extent do those technological investments and structural investments allow for the possibilities of social good? And to what extent are they sort of furthering the history that we've had in which engineers have been deeply involved in designing technologies that enhance our ability to inflict violent harm on other humans or non-humans, right? Nature. So there are, when I think of peace within engineering and peace as an outcome of engineering, I tend to think about ways in which the technological investments we make, I guess, one, bring out the best in us, and reduce the possibilities of us being violent towards each other, and this is something that I've been thinking about recently. How do we think about the future? How do we care about the future? If we look at the history of technological systems and infrastructural systems, those aren't only for now. Like we don't invest, we don't build things for now. Those things have long-term implications, and we're actually creating a path dependency for future generations. So if we continue to invest in, say, large-scale nuclear weapon systems, right? That means that in 10, 20, 30 years, people who are alive then and making decisions then actually have to think about, or their geopolitics, their politics are influenced by these weapon systems, right? And so at some level, we are handing the future a set of socio-technical, economic considerations and systems that they have to deal with, right? So it's not as if we're creating in a world in which people 50 years from now will be able to be at peace, right? Because they have this stuff that they need to deal with. So those are some of the ways in which I think about this intersection between peace and engineering. I hope that made sense.
Gosh, yeah, that made sense. And be careful, I'm gonna start making you answer those questions that you pose, because those are just so good. How did you get into thinking about engineering in this new, different way? Is that something that happened early on before you started your career, or in the middle?
I started in engineering because I love rockets and space and stars. I still love rockets and space and stars. Even though my work over the last few years has not focused specifically on space system design and aerospace engineering, I want to get back into it because I think it's really, really cool. But as I was studying aerospace engineering at the University of Michigan, I was also simultaneously involved in student organizing related to environmental issues. I've cared about environmental issues since I was pretty young. The merger, I guess, happened when at some point I realized that our ability to understand what we do on Earth and our impacts on the Earth as a system comes from our ability to go to space, right? Like remote sensing, satellite technology is super important in us trying to understand how the oceans flow or temperature distribution across the Earth or whatever, right? So like there's this sort of like very organic and integral tie between aerospace engineering and environmental protection. Given that I care about environmental issues and I think a lot about things like climate change, I always, in graduate school, I started thinking about how engineers justify to themselves the work that they do. Like, for example, if we take climate change, and I was studying combustion chemistry in graduate school at University of Michigan. Combustion chemistry gives us insight into how different kinds of air pollutants are formed, how greenhouse gases are formed, right? And we burn stuff all the time. So that's kind of what I was studying in aerospace engineering. But I was studying biofuel combustion, and biofuels are a technological response to climate change. I sort of characterized it as that, right? Engineers think that, or we think that carbon is the problem with our technological systems. If we can get rid of the carbon, then we've like addressed climate change, right? Whatever that means. And so biofuels are a way in which it might be possible to change the carbon cycle in a way that reduces our impact on the climate. And so I just started thinking about how engineers working on biofuel development think about the role of engineering and why biofuel development, right? Is that like the problem? Is the fuel the problem?
Yeah.
Or is there something about how we think about engineering and the systems that we design? Is that the problem? Is climate change simply another technological problem that we can innovate our way out of, right? Like, oh, let's just design new technologies,
right. Yeah,
and it'll be better. So all of that sort of led me to really think about the politics of engineering. and what we decide as meaningful problems to solve, like, and how we frame them. And so I started thinking about this notion of activist engineering. I just made it up,
Yeah.
right? Like, and but oftentimes engineers are trained in ways that they're not either given the freedom or the space to think about what they're doing and why they're doing it. And so when I say activist engineering, I'm simply talking about the ability to ask questions about why we're doing what we're doing.
Mm.
Because again, if you talk to a lot of practicing engineers who work for, all kinds of companies, they really can't ask those questions. There's no open dialogue about them. And so again, that just started me thinking about the politics of engineering, and then it just sort of snowballed into thinking about the social considerations of it, the human rights considerations of all, like the peace impacts of all of it, and being in aerospace engineering, where a lot of engineers end up going and working for large defense contractors, right? Because aerospace engineers are designing missiles and all that. I was sort of surrounded by folks who would end up working for the advancement of weapon systems.
Mm.
And I don't know, I was just like, it just sort of gave me pause.
Mm.
Like, this is what we're doing with all of this amazing human talent, right? Like, what? Or there's so many other things that we could be doing.
Yeah.
And I certainly get them, military industrial complex and like all of it. I understand that, but it's just sort of like I'm like, wow, this is the way, or this is how we value human talent, right? Their ability to like design the next missile system or something like that.
Yeah.
And I just feel like it's waste of human talent.
That's really interesting. Just that note about values, because I'm hearing that value, like what personal values of engineers are, what value we hold as a society, the human value that you're talking about there, the investments, like the monetary value that are made in those systems. It's just so interesting. So so the Constellation Prize, because I want to be sure we talk about that, was that an outgrowth of this kind of merger in activist engineering, or how did the Constellation Prize come to be? And maybe just like a quick intro to what it is.
Yeah, so I guess a bit of background is that we need to tell better stories about what is possible with engineering, I think. I interact with students and practicing engineers all the time who didn't sign up for engineering to get the kinds of careers that they're getting right now, right? They're like, I didn't study all this time to like get a job in an anonymous corporate building in a cubicle to design one little widget for a system that I don't really know much about, right? Like,
yeah.
Again, this sort of goes back to the wasted human talent. So me and Jerry and Mira and all these other folks who we've been talking for a long time had always felt like engineers want something else, right? And at the same time, there are folks who are doing interesting work that we're probably not aware of. And so the Constellation Prize was basically an attempt at us trying to identify engineers who may be like-minded or maybe doing things that are interesting to us, like related to environmental protection, human rights, peace, social justice, and to tell better stories so that if you're a student or if you're a practicing engineer, or even a retired engineer, you'd be like, oh, I didn't know I could use engineering to do that, right? Like, oh, so that was basically the inception of it. Like, how do we tell better stories and how do we build our network? So we're like, let's just come up with a prize and build a constellation of people who care about these issues. So that's where the Constellation Prize came from. And it's designed in a way that recognizes that it's not only engineers who are involved in this work, but they have to collaborate with people outside of engineering to do the engineering work well, to do the technological development work well. So it's open to not only engineers, but their collaborators. You can, community activists or lawyers. It could be anybody, right? I'm not sure if I recall even what your question was, but basically that's what the Constellation Prize is, and what we're trying to do with it is essentially let other people know that there are people out there that are like you, who care about these things, who you can learn from, who you can share ideas with. And, if I think about what the sort of the grand scheme this fits into, it really is around designing new kinds of cultures of engineering and hopefully new kinds of structures. And I'm using some sociological language here. Most people are not going to be entrepreneurs. Most people can't take the risks of entrepreneurship. You want to be able to, if you care about engineering for human rights, you should be able to go to a career fair and be like, yep, I can sign up for that job and make a living wage doing engineering work for this human rights organization or whatever, right? What that means, though, is to get to that point, there has to be formal structures that that are financially sustainable and economically viable for engineers to do this kind of work. So the Constellation Prize is part of a series of activities that we're doing, that I care about, that I'm working on, that's sort of around thinking about what a different culture looks like and thinking about what different kinds of structures, formal structures that can allow for people to make a living wage doing this kind of work look like. In sociology, there's this notion of fields that basically are spaces in which people are who they want to be, or they sort of enact what they care about. And fields are supported by social, cultural, symbolic, and economic capital. And so I've been thinking about the way in which the activities that we're doing in my labs are sort of filling out the social, cultural, symbolic, and economic capital aspects of a new field of engineering where, again, it's vibrant, it's sustainable, and again, it allows for more and more people to see themselves doing it.
That's really cool. And that notion of allowing people to enact, to have that, because you mentioned earlier on that engineers don't often get to think about those questions about personal values, about their goals, about their reasons for being there. And so creating that space to connect with others, but do it themselves. I wonder if you can give us like a real tangible example, because you're kind of on the front line of building this field with that, same definition you use, with kind of training new students into it. Like, what's a real tangible example of something that you are doing with your students that you feel like is building this new possibility?
Okay, so I have been thinking about who are the kinds of people that need to be engaged, or at what point will we have achieved success, whatever that looks like. And I've started thinking about three classes of people, right? You have students and people just coming out of college, you have mid-career professionals, and you have retired professionals. And to build this field, I feel like we need the expertise and engagement of people at all levels. The work that we've been doing sort of stretches across those three classes of people. One of the things that we're doing with students is being facilitated by a grant that we have from the Lemelson Foundation on just thinking about how they incorporate socio-environmental thinking into engineering design. Like, in what ways does that shape the design of artifacts, or the way in which they frame problems in the first place? So there's a framework that Lemelson Foundation has created called Engineering for One Planet that we've been using to try to understand how that framework can shape the engineering curriculum across all 4 years, so that students have constant touch points with this framework. And we're actually not even explicitly saying that this is part of the, like you have to think about environmental issues, or sorry, we're not explicitly saying that we're using an engineering for one planet framework. We're just saying to be an effective engineer, you really need to think about environmental issues. You really need to think about social impact. Like we're just saying that this is engineering, right? So it's sort of trying to impress on students that thinking about these things is inherent to doing engineering well.
It's not a
Okay?
separate niche.
It's not a separate, it's no, like to be a good mechanical engineer or a good designer, you have to think about this. There's no, no two ways about it.
Yeah.
So that's one thing that we're doing. And that's, again, more educational. At the other end of the spectrum, or engaging with retired folks, one of the things that me and some folks are doing is essentially trying to imagine a new kind of business enterprise. Like in the end, people are going to need jobs in this field, right? In peace engineering, whatever it is.
Yeah.
If a student come out, they have student debt, but they need to pay their bills, whatever. So they need jobs. And so what we're trying to do is essentially experiment with economic models that can support more engineers doing this kind of work. That's a very, I guess, in my mind, a fairly tangible thing that we're trying to do is like design an organization, firm, business, whatever it is, that can provide professional development training for more and more engineers to think about issues of environmental justice and climate justice and so on, because that's an important issue in the United States.
Yeah.
And I'm sure it is elsewhere as well, but like recently, I would say over the past decade or so, the issue of environmental justice has become more and more salient over here. And more and more engineers want to work on it. They don't oftentimes have the skills or the knowledge to work on it well. And so we're trying to address that gap. But the pie in the sky really is to be able to design a firm that can do engineering work. Like, okay, we do engineering work for people who lack access to engineering services, right? Right now, we have, government has access to engineers and scientists, large corporations do, even large nonprofit organizations have their own engineers and scientists.
Yeah.
But what about like all of the people who have important scientific and technological challenges, who don't have access to engineers and scientists, who can't ask like, oh, what would a design look like that addresses this problem that we have in our community, right? So we want to try to design a firm and monetize it in a way that provides those services in an affordable way to people who lack access to those services.
That's really interesting, because I mean, just speaking from personal experience here, I think what often happens is those of us working on smaller scale nonprofits, specific community action plans, it's just not even in the dreamscape, the possibility of doing something structure, like infrastructure related, or building technical related. And so the focus is instead all placed on social elements that we have expertise in and know we can do something about. But it's interesting to open up those possibilities for people, that you could widen your range of action.
Yeah, and I don't think in the end that volunteer efforts or pro bono efforts are going to meaningfully address the challenges that we have in society. Like, this work needs to happen at a much larger scale. The only way that's going to happen is if more people sign up to do this kind of work. And the only way that's going to happen is if there's like some economic viability to what we're doing.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's kind of where my mind is at. And we're just trying to, like, again, see what that means for people at different levels in their career, right? Like just starting off, mid-career, retired folks, and see what happens. So
that's so interesting. I have another question, but as I'm queuing that up, I want to just invite those here in the chat to also jump in with your own questions if you have them. I'm also interested who here is coming from an engineering background in the chat. So one dynamic that we see, Darshan, in many peacebuilding organizations internationally is that often they're filled with engineers because
Yeah,
it's just
that's
like a
so
really
interesting.
popular undergrad to get, and
Yeah,
people get their BA, but then they find jobs in these like international peace building firms or
yeah.
organizations, etc. But at least I haven't seen that tangibly come out in the types of projects or even the ways of approaching work, etc. So what do you think we can do, or what can peace building learn from this actually like broad base of engineering knowledge that is here?
Hmm. Oh gosh, I don't know. I think Jerry's a better person to ask that question too. Um, but so are you asking that um, engineers, when they engage with these organizations, are not bringing their engineering selves to this, and they're trying to like, or I guess maybe I'm a little confused about what you're asking. Is it?
Yeah. No, I appreciate the push to be specific. I think they're not bringing their engineering selves explicitly, maybe
Okay.
implicitly in the way that they think about and approach problems. But I
Yeah.
guess the question would be like, what kinds of thinking or tools are specific to engineering that you think could bolster peace building
Oh,
work
I see. I
in ways
see.
that they maybe aren't being now?
Okay, so I haven't fully thought this through, but um, I think having engaged with community-based organizations in the United States, um, and just like looking at the politics on the ground, it's very, very, very noisy. Like so many people are advocating for or wanting so many different kinds of things. So if we think about even environmental issues in the United States, um, even environmental groups themselves might be in conflict with each other at some level in like what they're asking for,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, oh, we think this needs to happen. Another group says, oh, we need that to happen. I think this is easy, I guess maybe easier said than done, but as an engineer, I always sort of go back to like, what are the leading order variables? Like, what are the sort of the big things that need addressing? Uh, and how do you prioritize
Mm-hmm.
what needs addressing and when? Um, in engineering, we know that you can't do everything. At some point, you have to draw a line and say, all right, this is where this is where we're drawing the line. That means that systems A, B, and C are not going to be to their fullest potential. However, they're going to serve their purpose and advance the cause or advance the system.
Right.
And so I think that there's a way of thinking about prioritization, about systems design, about understanding what are the most important issues to address, what are the second-tier issues to address, and so on. And I feel like that's a way of viewing the world or problem formulation that I think community groups can benefit more from engineers, because I think one of the challenges is that, and rightly so, like our community in a place feels like their issues are the most important issues.
Right.
Okay. And they are for them, right? I get that. But I've been thinking about what that means in conversation with the fact that we have very limited resources to deal with very large scale issues, right? So let me give you one example. If you think about water contamination in the United States, this is a problem that exists all over the place for various different reasons, right? Poor infrastructure, drinking water infrastructure, all the way to oil and gas exploration and like fracking and so on, right? Now, our community's water supply may have been damaged because of some fracking operation, right? It sort of led to some pollutant discharge or whatever. They care about it. 10 miles down the road, there's absolutely another community that's facing a similar issue. 20 miles down the road, there's another community facing a similar issue. So the question in my mind is, well, okay, if we have $10 million to do something, do you invest all $10 million in one place? Because the costs can go up pretty significantly if you want to like deal with a problem in a community.
Right.
Or is there a way to think about the use of the $10 million in a way that you recognize the common challenges that communities across a geographic space face and design something that meets the overlapping needs of multiple communities at once? What that will result in, perhaps, is, okay, community A's needs, you've met 95%. Community B's needs, you've only met 20%, but it's still 20%, right? So like there's sort of maybe differential impact, but you're impacting multiple communities at once. So I think there's this notion of scale that and thinking about what are the common features of the problems that people face and designing systems to address that, rather than like, we need to invest all of our time and money and resources and expertise in like a particular place. And again, I only say this because there are limited resources available for doing this kind of work, but the scale of the problems is pretty vast. So like, how do we have the most impact for the most people, while recognizing that we might not be able to address all of the challenges that everybody has?
Yeah, right. Yeah, that's an interesting consideration of like breadth versus depth, and the thinking about, I even took it in my notes, leading order variables in how you formulate a problem. I think is really interesting. I'm going to call in, speaking of limited resources, call in this question from Tim in the QA, and I'll just read it out if people are listening only. So Tim says, it's steep competition when governments around the world take trillions of dollars of society's good work and donate it to their military industrial complexes. Now a new engineer faces a $100K job offer in defense versus a $40K in renewable energy. How do we start to rebalance?
Gosh, I mean, we should talk, Tim, because this is exactly what we're trying to do with the business development aspects of this. I mean, I think my starting place, and I could be wrong, and so I want to hear from Tim and others on the call, but my starting place is we should design whatever we're doing with the goal of parity. Like, why should working on social justice be valued at $40,000 and working for an oil and gas company be valued at $100,000, right? Like, it should be like an engineer should be able to make $100,000 working on social justice challenges, right? So I think that's kind of what Tim's question is getting at, is like starting to rebalance this. I don't have an answer. Literally, I don't know. I think, though, where we can start is by really, really systematically identifying the strong desire to do this kind of work. I think often engineering education, and I think this isn't by accident, this is sort of organically emerged, maybe at some level by design, is that engineers are atomized. Like, just like we have engineers work on small widgets as part of larger systems, a lot of engineers don't know how other engineers feel about what they're doing. They might be having this dissatisfaction, like, oh man, like I want to be doing something else, but they're not talking to the person next to them, that whether they're feeling dissatisfied or not. And so I think we can start by simply identifying the number of people who want something else. We don't know that, right? Like it's all anecdote. Is there something systematically that we can do? What kinds of resources can we bring to bear that we have not brought to bear at this problem? The reason why I've been working with retired professionals is because they have a lot of resources that are necessary in building new enterprises, right? They have time, they have money, they have experience, right? So maybe there's an entirely untapped pool of engineering talent that we are just overlooking. We're focusing too much on students. I get the focus on students as academics, like that's where we're at, but students themselves aren't going to change the world in the way that the world needs to be changed. So I think the second point is, again, really recognizing what are untapped pools of knowledge, expertise, resources that we need to mobilize. And then, well, I think maybe starting with those two. If we can think through those two, list them out, do the kind of research work that's necessary to say, okay, we know that 25% of engineers in this geographic area care about this. That knowledge itself is powerful, because then you can start organizing around that. Yeah, that's where I'd start.
It's interesting.
So and that's what Tim was asking you. How do we start to rebalance?
Yeah,
I'm glad you asked that. So I
you
think
did
that's
start
what,
with a start.
yeah.
That's perfect. Paul has something in the chat too that I want to turn into a question, because it's related to something I've been thinking about as we're talking. So Paul, I'm reading it in for others. Paul says, agreed, sometimes a get it done mentality can overcome analysis paralysis and scarcity mindset among peace builders. Of course, at other times that mentality can be quite problematic. If I can form a question out of that last sentence, so the first time I even heard about engineering peacefully or peace engineering, like this combo that was happening, I felt a little trepidation, just personally, because I felt like peace building as a field started out in this very neoliberal mindset of, coming into a community, I see your problem, I've analyzed it, it's very technocratic, I will solve your problem for you. And it's been like a hard learning process as a field over several years and decades, that I'm just a student of, really, of saying, actually, no, that doesn't work. It has to be community led, and it has to be community priorities, etc. So I wonder, in working with this, rising generation, and teaching people how to engineer peacefully or consider these situations, how we're not just replicating that. Like, how can we learn from those lessons that we've already learned and not replicate that desire to just fix problems for people?
I mean, that's like, $1 million question. You've probably heard this before, and it's something that I think a lot about, is like, in what ways do we as engineers think of ourselves as service providers? In what ways can we have the kinds of discussions that allow us to formulate the social circumstance, the situation, the context, and the problem in a way that allows for the most meaningful outcomes? Skill building in that, which you do as a facilitator and mediator, which is super important work, I think is absolutely necessary. I think that I think what the range of tools that engineers have and they consider as engineering tools needs to be expanded. So it's not just about the ability to solve nonlinear differential equations using MATLAB, right? It's also how do I have a conversation with a lawyer? How do I have a conversation with a community activist? How do I have a conversation with a single mother about how they view the world and the way in which technological systems impact their being and their future? And I think that kind of the conversational aspects need to be considered an actual skill and need to be built out in more and more engineers. And so I think there's a huge opportunity to try to, I have about 5 minutes left, okay. I think there's a huge opportunity for groups like Build Up to make the case that doing engineering well requires a different set of skills. And I think that's part of the peace building paradigm, is the peace engineering paradigm as well. So just getting the engineers to say like, oh, and if I have this other ability, I'm a more effective engineer in the end, right? In these kinds of contexts. So I think that's one way to sort of start moving beyond this mentality, or this like constant the constant circumstance where it's like engineers come in, technocratic approach, whatever. I mean, I think the assumption that engineers might make that they know what they're talking about is problematic. Like they might, given the circumstances of the problem, but you can't assume that you know what the problem is when you go to a place.
Mm.
Um, so yeah, I think, yeah, the get it done thing is can be whatever. I made my point.
Yeah,
I made
yeah.
my point. Yeah.
I was just thinking, I lured you into this saying we're going to have this, conversation, and then we're just drilling you, Darshan, with all these questions.
No, that's good. That's good. You're making me think, which is wonderful. I'm actually glad you're recording this, so at least I can now like be like, oh, I said that. Okay,
Yeah,
cool.
that's what
I never thought that before.
that's awesome. Okay, I have another question, and giving people a chance. I put this in the chat, but we have just a couple minutes left. So if anyone has a final question, mine doesn't need to be it. But I was wondering, Darshan, for those who are listening and are peace builders that love rockets and space and want to integrate more engineering into what they do, or for those listening that are engineers and want to integrate more, peace building practices, field work opportunities, etc. Like, where can people go to find these overlaps?
Not a lot of places. um, uh, um, I'm not saying that I have the answers, but I'm willing to serve as a resource as much as possible, and open up my networks and connections as much as possible to help. I think that's kind of why the Constellation Prize is so important to what we're trying to do. Is we need to know who else is out there, because they have resources, they have knowledge, they have like all of this stuff that we can learn from and build from. um, uh, so I don't mean to sound pessimistic or negative, but I think that, it really depends on what you're trying to look for. Like, are you trying to look for employment in this space?
Mm,
Employment is much more difficult than like-minded people, right?
right.
And maybe we need to just start with it, like-minded people, and just sort of have to build this culture and the structures necessary to get to the point where more and more people can be employed in
Mm,
this. But I do know that there's so many organizations and networks that you can tap into that are asking these critical questions about what engineering is for.
mm,
So there's the Science for the People network in not only in it may exist elsewhere as well, but at least within the United States, Science for the People is one of them. If you're looking for a more, I would say, policy focused network of people, the American Geophysical Union has a program called Thriving Earth Exchange. That's amazing. The American Association for the Advancement of Science has a program called On-Call Scientists, that actually it might have the most overlap and synergies with folks who care about peace building. So On-Call Scientists is creating a network of people just like we're doing with Project Confluence. And I'll make a plug for Project Confluence towards the end. But they're developing a network of statisticians and mathematicians and toxicologists and psychologists, like all of these scientists and engineers, to give pro bono services to human rights organizations around the world. I know Teresa Harris, who's the program director, manager of On-Call Scientists. She's amazing. Of course, there's the Union of Concerned Scientists within the United States that actually does advocacy in this space related to climate, nuclear weapons, like all kinds of different issues. That's what I can think of off the top of my head. I think there are actually some significant there are employment opportunities in Washington, D.C., in the United States, for engineers who care about these kinds of policy, political issues.
Mm,
And I'm happy to have conversations with folks if they're interested.
that's awesome.
Um, so what I was going to say regarding Project Confluence, I'm going to use you, Julie, to spread the word with a bunch of folks.
Please do.
Project Confluence is a series of activities that we're doing to mobilize more engineers and scientists. And it sort of started spilling or snowballing into lawyers and medical professionals as well, to deploy their services for communities that are addressing environmental, climate, and energy justice challenges in the United States. So the business development work that we're doing, some grant work that we're doing that's funded by the National Science Foundation on understanding collaborations between engineers and scientists and community groups. All of that is sort of falling under this umbrella that we're calling Project Confluence. And as part of that, we are in the process of building an online portal that will allow, it's basically like a dating site for engineers and scientists and community groups that want to collaborate with each other on issues that relate to energy, environment, and climate in the United States. So I'll let you know when that launches.
Awesome.
And spread the word to your networks.
Yeah, we'll include it in our newsletter and the comms we sent out. I put the links of what you noted here in the chat, including just if you can check that I got the right Project Confluence link there.
Yep,
so
that's it. That's it. Yep.
Save it and visit after.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you so much, Darshan, for this conversation. I'm left with more questions, I think, than I started, which maybe is a good place to be. So it just means we'll have to.
I mean, that's just a reflection of where I'm at. Like, I literally every day is more questions than answers. Like, what? Really? That's the way the world, like, it's just more and more questions. So I'm just getting more and more confused as I get older.
They're good questions. They're needed. Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you again. And thanks to those who joined. Again, this will be posted later today and we'll send out the link so that you can have it on hand and share with your colleagues and networks.
Thank you so much. And I hope everybody is doing as well as they can be, given the circumstances. Peace and love to everybody.
Yes. All right. Bye.
Bye.